The last 9 months has seen a vicious war of attrition unfold in towns like Ugledar, Soledar, and Bakhmut. But this should not be interpreted as a stalemate, as those struggles seem to have degraded the quantity of functional Russian equipment and depleted their fighting potential. Will Ukraine's counteroffensive finally bring an end to Russia's genocidal and pointless war? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content, please do support us and consider becoming a patron. Maria Drutska works in Ukraine's defense sector and shares her informed and pointed thoughts on defense policy and foreign affairs through her popular accounts on Twitter and YouTube. Her updates on the Russo-Ukrainian war also have a dedicated audience, which are attracted also to her humor and sarcasm. Maria also describes herself as a professional Vatnik basher. Maria, welcome to the channel.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, in such a flattering introduction, and thank you for having me on your channel. And if I may, I want to thank you for all your work that you do, because I've been following your interviews, your work for a while, and I'm fascinated of the prominent speakers that you invite, that you cover such a broad range of topics, and it is very important because I'm sure your audience is also with different interests. They can all find the topics that they are interested in on your channel. So it's fantastic, and I'm very happy to be here with you today.
Well, I'm very, very flattered. And it's interesting that we sort of mentioned your humor and we mentioned Twitter. And I think, whereas many of the topics on this channel are, pretty serious and, we try and lighten them where we can. They are, however, pretty heavy topics. Nonetheless, on Twitter, I have a slightly different persona, as I think you do as well. And that is, of course, using humor to fight this struggle and to resist Russian disinformation. And that's incredibly important, isn't it? Mocking them and using humor as a weapon.
Absolutely. Well, that's what Ukrainians are now, including other stuff that we are famous for. That's what we are famous for now as well, for our sense of humor. And, it is slightly different personality. It's a part of my personality, but on Twitter, of course, I allow myself, to joke and use dark humor and sarcasm as well. And that's basically how I started my Twitter. If you let me mention a few words about that, because when the war just started, of course, it was very difficult psychologically, and we couldn't understand, including myself, what was going on. And that's basically how I started Twitter, and it is in English to, of course, let our foreign partners, foreign supporters support us more and understand what is actually going on. But then, to make some psychological pressure less for myself, even, I started to use some humor and general jokes. I'm sure my early followers remember about jokes about dead generals in Kherson trenches or something, because it was not a joke, actually. They were there, quite dead, but yeah, so it is very important, not to lose sense of reality and somehow keep sane to ourselves. And the humor, of course, is one way to do it.
And of course, we'll try to mention Russia as little as possible, but the sheer incompetence and absurdity. Now, we know there's also horrific brutality, which is in no way, humorous, but sometimes the sheer incompetence and pointlessness of their war. I mean, that in itself does generate a huge amount of humor. Also, fortunately, it means that many of their campaigns have not been successful. The campaign to take Kiev, the campaign to conquer Kharkiv was unsuccessful, and to hold Kherson. I mean, it's a litany of failure, some of them absolutely absurd.
Absolutely. And of course, I hope we will speak about it later, and I will mention it later about basically why Putin, well, the part of why he behaves like he does, because he has not fully been informed even what was going on, because all his generals and all his advisors, let's say, they're just scared, have always been and scared even now, to tell him the truth of these um, hilarious failures, you know. And yes, of course, we should not underestimate the enemy. However, all these memes and all these funny sketches come from the reality, from the truth. So, and they should be pointed out as such, of course.
I don't know if you've seen the movie Death of Stalin. There's a comedy movie that a British director made about something where you think, Stalin, how's that going to be funny? But he made a movie about the last days of Stalin and all of the, senior characters of the Politburo who are around. And of course, in interviews, actually, everyone thinks it's exaggerated. He actually said he had to tone it down because reality was so absurd that it would be completely unbelievable. But it is the most grotesque and hilarious movie. I'm going to have to say I'm looking forward to the movie in a few years, The Death of Putin, because that also is going to be an absolute clown show, I think, with distance, we will be able to laugh at his demise.
Absolutely. I think Netflix has already been working on some kind of series, and of course, I'm sure that movie industry will just explode after after Ukraine win the war. So we win the war first, yeah, and then I'm sure that we will all be visiting cinemas and enjoy different kinds of movies, starting from action, dramas, and finishing, of course, comedies. It's gonna be amazing.
Well, let's turn to something more serious, because this idea of victory, I think it's something which most of the speakers on this channel share, a strong confidence of total Ukrainian victory. But the question is when that happens and at what cost. And I think there's a serious point here, which is, could victory come sooner? Could it have come sooner, even before now, if sanctions had been more effective? And in a minute, we'll also turn to the idea if more effective weapons had been supplied sooner.
Absolutely. So, if I may, thank you for that. You raised a very important issue, sanctions. You know, I just want to say that I'm not a sanction expert. However, I've done research on that because this topic was also interested to me as well. And I realized that many Ukrainians as well, but as well as our foreign friends, my friends, partners, they do not fully understand what sanctions are and how they work. Because, you know, in terms of war, we use what attracts more is basically the practical result that we see on the spot. For example, which is, for example, weapons, usage of weapons, right? So we use, let's say, HIMARS, and we see exactly the result of usage of that at the spot. However, sanctions works a little bit different, and then people started like to question themselves. So do we actually need them, or you just give us give Ukraine more weapons, or if it's Ukrainian, like, you know, sanctions fine, but like let's concentrate on the weapons and equipment. So I would like to start, for example, to those who we're not familiar with this. What basically Russia under the sanctions is. And it is very interesting to know that Russia now is the most sanctioned country in the world. And since the full-scale invasion in Ukraine started, Russia has become the subject to more than 13,000 restrictions, which is more than to combine Iran, Cuba, and North Korea together. And Well, a few words. What was Russia before the war? We know that even with its state-controlled economic structure, Russia still prioritized, of course, technological advancement. They wanted, to release themselves from the like reliance on fuel exports, and let's say very unrestricted flow of capital they had before. However, now after the war, policies has been changed. Completely. Now they implemented control of the capital movement. They classified countries as friendly countries, allies, and enemies, or unfriendly countries, right? They started using Chinese yuan more during their transactions. They increase, of course, the military spending. And, everyone hoped that Russian Federation would it would force them to change their behavior, to get scared of sanctions. But unfortunately, reality did not meet the expectations, right? And there are very important, of course, majority of sanctions. They are limit export of Russia gas and coal, and also restrictions on sale luxury goods, professional services, access to funds of IMF, of World Bank, and SWIFT payment system, right, for the Russians. And I think now it's about $300 billion of Russian assets that have been frozen, right? So let me also mention that what paradox is, because it is really very interesting to point out that sanctions have strengthened actually Russia in the short-term perspective, while world economy, European economy got some shock of the sanctions as well, because of course everything is connected. They had a big trade and other economical movement with Russia together. So while they are kind of getting over of shock, Russia was strengthening itself inside, but it is in short-term perspective. However, in mid-term, and that's what people do not see now, and they are questioning kind of importance of sanctions, but in mid and long-term, it is very important. And in mid and long term, sanctions will be devastating for Russian economy. And, now they have ability to continue the war. However, they do not have ability for advancements as they did in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, right? So the most important is to strengthen sanctions, to tighten them on different levels. And well, if I may also mention how arms export influence on Russia as well, because of course it's also generating of capital, and if to speak about arms export after our foreign partners, let's say Russia's potential clients, seeing the performance of Russian weapons on the Ukrainian on the battlefield in Ukraine, they kind of started to reevaluate their contracts, agreements. So, for example, I read that India has permanently terminated the contract for Me helicopters, and then for Ka-31 helicopters as well, and then followed by Philippines, who also terminated the purchase of transport helicopters. And yeah, this all influence, of course, of working capital, let's say.
And they still have equipment though, don't they? So the Indian army and others around the world and certain governments in the Middle East, they will still have quite a large stock of Russian equipment from previous purchases. So they will need parts and supplies. How are they able to get those with the sanctions regime in place? And of course, many of these components require high technology elements to them, which Russia is now finding it difficult to import. So how does this servicing of this sort of legacy equipment work?
Of course, yes. Those countries, speaking about them, they have a big stocks of Soviet equipment, and well, they will have difficulties, let's say, because of course Russia does not have enough to maintain and to change their spare parts and other components themselves, right? Not even we're talking, not even about export of them. However, you mentioned components, and this is also very interesting because in terms of work, even we, like I faced with this issue as well. And I would like to mention that like Russian enterprises now, they have a big stock of foreign imported components. However, sooner or later, these stocks will run out, right? And we could think, for example, that Russia would relocate their market to some other countries, for example, like China or India. But first of all, they would face with poor quality, and secondly, that those countries would be put in the risk themselves to be banned by the US and by European countries, right? So the one of the, let's say, very few options how Russia can get their the components for weapons and equipment is contraband. And they've been doing this since 2014 and through third countries. However, also it's important to mention that now even this way is more difficult than it was before, because you know the US and EU has increased control over this to third countries, but our institutions that make research of the shot down drones and weapons, etc. Well, it's this information has been public that a lot of components are still of foreign origin from the countries of NATO. And yeah, this is something that also need to be more tightened and more control, of course. And to wrap up, if I may, to wrap up the sanctions topic, because we will not get deep into that, and as well as you know, it's not my area of expertise, but it is important to mention missiles, because we all know, you know, our audience know here that last 2 months, let's say beginning of May, I think it started to intensify missiles attacks, right? And it is important to notice, because to mention this, because before, you know, analysts were like, Russia will run out of missiles soon, because we remember all this mass missiles attack during the winter when they were targeting our critical infrastructure, right? They wanted to freeze us, they wanted to leave us without the light, and you know, there was a mass missile attack, like 70, sometimes even 100. So of course, everyone were hoping that missiles will finish soon, and however, we did have this few months of let's say pause of this big scale attacks. However, they renewed as well again. Speaking about kinzhals, so Russia used 6 of them on in the beginning of May when they attacked Kiev, and in the whole during the whole, like, what, 15 months, they used 20 kinzhals only. Well, only, let's say it's still a lot, but 20 kinzhals over the course of the year, and 6 they used in May, right? So according to our military intelligence, GUR, I think in stock there are, like they said, it is about 50 or even less left. They also deliver Caliber cruise missiles a few times per month to Crimea. But Russia now currently can produce itself about 25 calibers per month, about only 2 kinzhals per month. Well, 2, it's still a lot, but still, right? And ballistic missiles to Iskander, I think around 5, as far as I remember. And we see that Russia is facing problems and difficulties with producing kinzhals. They still do, but not a lot. But the main thing is that, speaking about them, 130 components for kinzhals are of the origin and manufacture of the United States. So, of course, due to sanctions again, they have now difficulties to manufacture them. So the only way, let's say, to get these components is what I've mentioned before, through smuggling.
That still, however, is a higher production rate than we perhaps estimated or thought Russia was capable of. And possibly their stocks of these missiles were greater than perhaps our estimates, because is it fair to say that in some ways the sanctions have failed because they were intended to do a number of things? They were intended to stop the Russian war machine, to persuade Russia that this aggression needs to stop. Neither of those have happened. And the unspoken aim was to destabilize the Russian regime to the point where the so-called elites would push for the war to end, because it's clearly against their interests. They're making less money. Their money abroad has been, frozen. Their yachts have been taken. They can't go to their villas in Italy. We thought this would have some kind of impact, but I think the point you made earlier is incredibly interesting. And I've heard, I think it was Michael Naki and others who are on Channel 24 talking about this. Putin, in the short term, seems to have actually consolidated his grip on power. Those who are likely to oppose him, he's let them leave. More than 1 million. The estimate is now between 1 and 3 million Russians who would have been less likely to, be turbo patriots have left the country. There's sweeping repression internally, but also there's a segment of the population that is, completely, wants to accelerate the war. He seems, for the moment, to have created a more stable regime. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be stable in the mid to long term, but is it fair to say sanctions have not really achieved their objectives?
Well, let's say, good question. Let's say yes and no. As I mentioned, of course, Russia in the short term, they strengthen themselves. Speaking about personnel reserves, it is a big issue. So the sanctions that were imposed, like now, and even like in the beginning, maybe like half a year, they felt after the beginning of the war, they felt it more, that personnel shortage, all these, let's say, they faced with so-called like drain of brains began, and it is a big issue because all smart people, let's say, from young people from IT technologies, right, in the industrial complex, let's say, people feel this and they just leave the country. So it is a very big issue. And speaking about elites that you've mentioned as well, well, this is now regarding personal individual sanctions, because actually the big number of sanctions, they meant to be imposed on individuals who can neither visit, for example, Western countries, or nor gain access to their property and wealth that they store there. Because we all know, of course, that Russian elites, oligarchs, big businessmen, first of all, they don't keep their money, most of money inside Russia, right? And like they have their parallel life somewhere in Europe, in Italy or Spain. They have families living in London. Kids are going to school, to elite schools in the UK, in the US, all over the Europe, you know. So the question was always that these sanctions, whether they are used, it's to the way to punish these people to be close to regime, right? Or the regime that's responsible for aggression and for the war, or they were imposed to make these people put pressure on this regime, because you know, when you feel inconvenience and you know, you have uncomfortable lifestyle, you feel some unpleasantness, then sooner or later they will push this regime and people and demand to kind of moving to the end of the war. So we're still waiting for, again, like sanctions slash patience, you know. It's not like weapons like Storm Shadow that you just launch it and you have 100% of effectiveness. So sanctions means patience, and it will work more in medium and long-term perspective.
Well, mentioning Storm Shadow, there are an incredible array of weapons being supplied now, and even the anti-aircraft missiles are being topped up, fortunately, because we now see that Russia is trying to sort of deplete your anti-missile defenses. These things are coming through, but it's taken a long, long time. You know, it took a huge campaign, which I know you were very vocal about, with freeing the Leopards, getting the tanks over. That took 6 months to make that happen. We're now in the fight to get F-16s. Again, it's taken months and months of pointing out why these are necessary, why they're an absolutely essential part of a combined arms approach, which is the only way that's going to comprehensively defeat Russia. These things have not come in the quantities that's required. They have not come soon enough. It's taken a huge amount of effort to get them. And I have to pose the difficult question that even though we're confident of a Ukrainian victory, could that victory have come a lot sooner if the West had not dithered and dragged its feet? And how many Ukrainian lives have, could have been saved if actually those weapons arrived sooner?
Well, this is the question, of course, more probably philosophical, I would say, because first of all, we would never know. Second is, I want to emphasize that we all are very grateful to our Western partners, because it's not a secret that we now depend on Western support on different levels, right? Social level, the like Ukrainian state budget, of course, including weapons and ammunition. So speaking about now, I don't think that we need to discuss what could be if it could happen earlier. However, what we need to do, and our partners need to do, is to learn lessons from what happened in the past and try to avoid these mistakes, or not mistakes, because I'm pretty sure that it was those moments, let's say, of course, for me as a Ukrainian, for Ukrainian people, we would want to have F-16s, after 2 months of the starting full-scale invasion. But looking into the terms of how it was, on my opinion, most of the deliveries and most of the packages that were issued by our foreign partners, they were necessary in time. You know, it was a time when we needed these javelins and loves, and we were given them. Then it was a time when we needed Bayraktars, right? We were provided with Bayraktars. Of course, when it, in terms of then, you know, armored vehicles, etc. Then when it came a time to, you know, speak about counteroffensive, I don't think that we could start it earlier, right? Because first of all, there were a lot of points, like when we couldn't, for example, even the weather, let's take into consideration, right? Because everyone would think that it could start in May or April. However, we saw that the weather was not suitable for that and for tanks and heavy vehicles to pass, right? So speaking about would it be, you know, better to get Leopards delivered, important was first of all the political decisions, right? So with this, probably it could be done faster, right? However, our partners do great job, especially now and the last few months, to deliver all weapons and equipments as fast as possible, and like it is very fast, you know. So I don't think that we need to discuss now like hypothetical theories. We need to bring these issues, learn lessons, and you know, do whatever is more effective now. Speaking about F-16s, right? We have now political agreement, political decisions on providing F-16s. It is very important. Our pilots are going to start soon. They haven't, but it's been discussing. They are starting their training soon. So I think even, well, speaking about Germany, for example, need to take, you know, into consideration, of course, their historical background. And this what happened with Leopards, and we need to remember their history. We need to remember that people did not get over, let's say, the past, which was not a very long time ago. We think that it was a long time ago, right? But it was not really. So it's still like in there, they were growing up with these values, right? And now it's just, who would have thought that just almost behind the door, it would be kind of vice versa. And it was a shock, of course, for citizens, for regular people. So to do what, like the decisions that have been made in Germany, let's say, starting even with personal, regular people to, you know, change their perspective, change their mind, and thus give a support to the government to make these decisions. It is very important, you know.
And Chancellor Scholz made a very fiery speech recently where peace activists, and I think we both know what the euphemism for peace activists actually means, you know, they push for a peace deal, they push for negotiation, they push essentially what is a Kremlin narrative in the guise of, you know, pacifism. And Scholz was very, very harsh with them, I think rightly so. So there's two topics that kind of emerge from that idea. One, of course, is what would an acceptable peace deal look like? I mean, I'm not convinced that any kind of peace deal is possible at the moment, or even for some time. But clearly there are a number of peace deals being pushed around by China and, of course, the African delegation this week that came to Kiev. So there's that nature of the peace deal. But also, if you take Scholz's quite sort of passionate statements in defense of Ukraine, the other question is it really starting to sink in now amongst Western politicians how much of a threat Russia actually is and how far it has degraded civilizationally back towards, you know, an extreme tyranny, almost, I would say, to state barbarism?
Yeah, well, first of all, as you said, peace rally, or it was, I think, as far as I remember, very pro-Russian rally, right? So probably it also influenced on Chancellor Scholz for his to give that passionate speech. However, I do believe, and I'm very convinced even, that Europe now starting to, to not even understand it, but slowly changes narratives and their policies. Because in Europe's history, not long time ago, we had many imperial powers. However, now we don't have that. But the Russian Empire still, have this, how to say, phantom pain of the time when once Russian Empire was great. So they still have these imperial ambitions, and this what Europe starting to understand, or not starting, but like understand now, that this is a threat that Europe have to their peace and security, and Russia is trying simply to change the world order and peace order. So of course Europe does not, like, cannot let this happen, right? And there are many threats, not like, I'm not even speaking about, let's say, our neighbors like Poland or Baltic states, that they understood, let's say, better than other countries the threat that Russia possessed to them, right? But even speaking about different, like, other threats, like, we don't need to go far. Latest strike on dam, right? It is, and strikes on the energy and critical infrastructure in winter. It all cause and could cause even nuclear catastrophe, because we see Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, right? What they were doing with Chernobyl. So in general, this full-scale invasion into Ukraine brings not only threat to the, let's say, neighbor countries like Baltics, like Poland, because of Belarus, of course, and other. But it's just a huge changes to all the system of European world order. So I think we are moving in the right directions. And speaking, I think, speaking well about Germany, you mentioned, I think they even now considering to supply of fighter jets to Ukraine. So if it is what we've talked before, it is a big, moves for them. So it is very obvious that we are moving to the right direction. Europe moving to the right direction. NATO countries moving to
And the
right
Swedish ones, I think it's the Gripen fighters are now potentially going to come to Ukraine as well. So that's an extraordinary change. And this idea of Russia acting as a terrorist state, we see that in bombing of apartment buildings. We see it in attacks of the energy infrastructure. But probably the biggest example recently is the Kakhovka Dam. But the destruction of the dam hasn't got, I think, nearly enough attention in the media. And the full implications of it, I don't think, have been understood, because this is an incredible act of barbarism, ecocide, terrorism.
Well, yeah, it is. And I've made, like, when it happened, I made quite a few videos on my YouTube on that, and I will not repeat them. If people want to, I mean, I'm sure everyone researched and heard what causes and consequences would bring it, and I've explained it also very clear. However, speaking about that, it's not enough. On my opinion, it's not enough attention that European, like EU and other countries give to this catastrophe. honestly, and I don't understand why. I don't understand how people cannot see. I mean, there are a lot of analysts, experts in these areas as well. So what, there are not enough papers published, so let's, you know, push to this. Just do the research. It's a huge ecological catastrophe, and I'm not even talking about the catastrophe and the grief for Ukrainian people, you know, because it's just war, people are dying, but then you have this when you were just liberated, you know, but from the different catastrophe, I mean, the same source of this cause, however, different catastrophe happened, and they lost everything again. And the people forget that Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is just there, you know, and there are threats to blow it, to mine it, and I don't know which, we need to check which results the head of the Grossi just visited Zaporizhia, I think, nuclear power plant, as well as he is going or went already. I haven't followed to Moscow, right? So it is just a huge catastrophe. I'm very sad, honestly, that not enough attention was paid to this recently. And of course, we talk about international NGOs, not NGOs, sorry, international organizations like UN, like, well, the Red Cross unfortunately lost its credibility a long time ago in Ukraine. However, not enough reaction from the UN, it also upsets us.
Yes, absolutely, and rightly so. Well, let's turn to this idea of a peace deal, because that word comes up a lot. Whenever there seems to be a sort of quiet period on the front, you hear the voices, the clamor for a peace deal get louder and louder. But I think there are voices on the other side. And I think in particular, Anders Puck-Nielsen did a good video on that recently. Vlad Vexler's mentioned this. We also have many commentators on Ukrainian media. Again, people like Michael Nack and others talk about this, and that is that a peace deal is not possible as long as Putin is in charge. One, he seems to have no understanding of what's really going on. He has no inclination to sign a realistic peace deal. No one, I think, believes he would adhere to the terms of any peace deal. And at this point, it is almost distasteful. Well, it's entirely distasteful to actually sign any kind of document with a genocidal dictator. So I don't know what your thoughts are on what peace will eventually look like, but is that going to have to wait for Putin's demise before that's a realistic possibility?
Well, both sides, they said that now it is no room for negotiations, and it's not possible negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. That's amazing, of course, that everyone wants to be involved, wants to, you know, give us a hand. Of course, everyone has their own interests, and by everyone I mean these prominent countries that offered us their kind help, as China and what Brazil, I think, even South Africa, other African countries, right? However, we, as you know, part of the war, the one that fighting this war, and the ones whose territories have been illegally annexed by the aggressor, I think we have, let's say, priority right to decide what would, let's say, peace would be for us, and what is the winning of the war would be for us. So Ukraine is very straightforward with that. Our president makes a very clear statement that for us it is important to get to the borders of Ukraine of 1991, which includes Donbass and Crimea, right? However, what we see now is that NATO, let's say, the European country, well, Western world, they have not decided to themselves what would be this peace deal, or what would be the victory of Ukraine or the loss of Russia, right? And we come to the point of security guarantees. Western countries have not decided what which security guarantees they can provide us. And there is now a problem with basically finalizing. So if we don't have an aim, like Ukraine is very clear, we have one aim, to liberate territories. However, it's also within the Western countries' interest to make sure that Russia will not freeze this conflict. And I'm sorry to remind, but we all remember 2014 and illegal occupation of Crimea, and how that after that, like, I'm not going to blame anyone. However, the not strong enough reaction of the Western world, let's say, was a part what led to today's reality. So after 2014, people still were inviting Putin to the table, shaking his hands, pouring the tea, speaking about, life, and buying his cheap gas. That's not happening now. Okay, that's at least a good. However, they need to decide which security guarantees they can provide. For Ukraine, of course, security guarantees would be after, let's say, Ukraine's victory, after some time. Of course, I'm not saying we don't need to meet requirements. We do need to meet requirements to be a NATO member. And President Biden mentioned this recently as well, that Ukraine needs to meet requirements, and we want to meet all requirements. However, accepting Ukraine to NATO would be a perfect security guarantee, let's say. So until then, frozen conflict, no one needs a frozen conflict, right? We all remember what was after 2014, and it was, we still have war on the east of Ukraine. However, it kind of, was like a frozen, or they wanted to freeze it, right? No one helped us to make straight moves to liberation of the Donbass. So we need to avoid this, because otherwise Russia will, and we see this in terms of the history. The big bear, I even remember, is in my mind, this meme. I don't know if you see that, like the picture and the four small pictures inside, where the big bear, like attacking, then it was defeated, and then it was like regrouping or healing, and then in 30 years, or maybe this time it would be more or less, regrouping, reinforcing, and attacking again, right? So no one wants our children to fight the same wars that we are fighting now. So that's what West needs to decide for themselves and for us.
And the other side of that, I think, is, and Ukraine is in no way responsible for Russia's political system and its mess. However, a frozen conflict would likely keep the current group of criminals in charge of the Kremlin. It would have, what you would have is an aggressive neighbor with a ruthless regime, a regime that are partly dependent on, Z patriots, on aggression, on imperialist values. Nothing would change in that instance. And that sort of reckoning or realization of their actions wouldn't happen. Russia could spin a frozen conflict as a victory, and the regime can survive. Whereas a resounding defeat, like the one that Russia experienced in 1905 against Japan and many others, these caused huge systemic changes in Russia. And I think in this instance as well, it's only through a massive defeat we're likely to see any change at all. Now, we don't know what direction that change would be. We don't know whether Russia could become a more civilized country, a more European rule of law leaning country, or whether it could get could go in the other direction and continue its civilizational decline. We don't know that. But what we do know is that a defeat would at least prompt some kind of changes. And Ukraine needs, Russia's not going to go away, unfortunately. Ukraine either needs to be able to defend itself as part of the NATO alliance, or in future, ideally, have Russia that is a better neighbor, dare I say it.
Absolutely. Well, I keep saying that if Putin dies tomorrow, which would be not a bad thing, of course. However, it would not more likely change the course, because still they have already kind of successors for his position, right? And it's all even being said that he supposed or they prepared him to step off the throne in the beginning of this year, and they already had someone like to replace him, right? So, and which means that they would just continue this narrative, they continue the war, etc. So yes, the regime what needs to be changed, and Putin's death would not, I mean, we could probably have some cocktails in the evening, however, for that. However, it would not change the big course of the event. So the regime needs to be changed, and that what would also help. Now what is going on in Russia, we also don't know what will be like in the further months, because they also have they started having inner house chaos for in their, let's say, family, inside the family. So we could just hope that it will develop, the events will develop in the advantage to us, to Ukraine.
And really, the last question. Let's try and end on a slightly more optimistic note, or not. I mean, this is up to you and how to answer this. But how do you see the counteroffensive, which it's clearly underway now? How do you see the outcome of that? Can the outcome only be positive? I mean, it's going to come at a huge cost, but are you optimistic for the success of the counteroffensive?
Um, I'm very optimistic in general, so of course I am optimistic. However, well, we have a big hope for counteroffensive, as well as our European partners, well, NATO partners have a big hope and expectations. This puts a little bit of pressure, of course, for our military leadership, for our soldiers. I mean, pressure like psychological pressure. However, we understand that territories will not we will not get territories back as soon as we would want to, and speaking about, because again, I will emphasize that we have paid enough and too high cost for anything but victory that is borders of 1991, including Crimea, and this is it has a big support in the population, of course, as well as the military political leadership statement we all see. So taking territories back, would it be tough? Yes. Would it be, long and bloody battles and fights? Yes. We need to remember that, well, as Budanov, the head of intelligence, said in one of the interviews, I don't remember which one, that there are 400,000 Russian soldiers who are fighting in Ukraine, and that including army as well as military companies that are here as well. So Russians do not have capabilities, resources, reserves to repeat these large-scale offensive actions that they were doing in the beginning. All what they do, they were preparing, of course, for defense all the time. And regarding Crimea, a Ukraine victory again is in Crimea, I mean, is unlikely to happen in the nearest future, right? Because, and we all understand that. I mean, it is, of course, easier to make a public statement, beautiful slogans, etc. And we all need that for, you know, psychological health, to keep up the spirit. However, realistically, we understand. And as much as I would like to go to the beach to Crimea during the velvet season, as we called it, in September, you know, and drink a cocktails there. However, it is unlikely will work out this September, you know. So what we need is, we need long-range weapons. We need other, you know, systems, air defense, to fasten this victory. However, well, this counteroffensive, this is, let's say, well, someone, maybe even General Navy, pointed it that this would be, let's say, one of the chances, or maybe the only chances this year, to have some results. So we would not be able to launch second counteroffensive after this, right? We have big expectations. We are positive. We know that it will be very difficult. It would cost us a lot of lives, unfortunately. It is very sad. However, we do not have other choice, because we are fighting for our existence. And that's why we cannot be anything but positive on that.
Well, Maria, I think for everyone watching this channel, you and all Ukrainians are a huge inspiration. And I think you've also helped us to realize how precious freedom is, that it doesn't, you know, freedom is not free. And that all of us at some point may be called on to defend it in a way that we'd assumed, you know, is something for the history books, but is very much, you know, actually the future that we're all facing. And if we don't fight for it, then it's quite clear that it will disappear like the morning mist.
Absolutely. And I do hope, and I would invite you, of course, to join us all at, you know, Crimea party and cocktails when we have it after liberation. We are really looking forward for that. And I will invite all my friends, all supporters, you, Jonathan, as well. So we are just sure that it will happen. It will happen sooner, hopefully. But we are hoping for the brighter future after the war as well. And thanks to your support, to support of the audience, to all our foreign friends, because without you, we would not be at the same position as we are now.
Well, Maria, thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!